So, going back and thinking about exactly what we were trying to accomplish with these switches and writing this speedometer, um, I got to thinking a better way to do this is probably going to be to use the Raspberry Pi itself. And the reason is because using the other board, we still have to have something to drive it, and it also doesn't really lend itself too much to being able to interactively write a program, or at least not without a computer to sit and run beside it. And so you were going to end up having to have a Raspberry Pi anyway. Now, the thing that's cool about a Raspberry Pi, one is it's small, it doesn't take a lot of power to run it, and it also has these GPIO general purpose pins, input output pins that are over here on the side. And so what it allows us to do is to write a Python program that actually runs on the Raspberry Pi and will actually control the switch just like it does in the on the other computer. So I've come back over here to the Raspberry Pi and I've written a program. We're going to take a look at it here in just a second. And so what you have here, and I'm going to also show the illustration of these general purpose pins so that we can actually see what they all do. So right now what I have is I have the ground plugged in to the third pin down on the outside of the board, and then I have the power plugged into the second pin on the outside of the board, and then the state pin that we have that goes to our switch I have plugged into GPIO 2. It's a little confusing because it calls it GPIO 2, but it's actually pin 3, but you'll see that in the illustration here in just a minute. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a little program, and I'm going to show you the program that is going to detect when we have pushed the button 5 times, and then it's going to exit out of the program. And the reason is because it'll show you how to get yourself in a loop to actually keep looking for this, and how to count how many times this thing has been pressed. We still have a lot more work to do in the program, but this should get us started so we can actually see what this thing is doing and see how we're going to use the Raspberry Pi itself to drive the entire speedometer control. Okay, so we are looking at the Raspberry Pi and we're logged in, and we're going to be taking a look at a couple things. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to go back to our home directory here and clear this. Now if you forgot to open this screen, we're going to go up here to this terminal box up here at the top of the Raspberry Pi. So the first thing we want to do is, when we're writing code, we want to try to keep it organized so we know where the code is when we go back to look at it later. And so to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm in my home folder, and we are going to do an ls, which is going to show us a list of what's in this folder. And you'll notice that there is a folder over here called source. So to create that folder, because I want all my source code inside that folder, I typed mkdir space source, and that created that folder. Once I got that folder created, I cd'd, that's changed directory into source. We'll do a ls, and then I typed make dir python to create a Python folder. And the reason is because at some point in the future, we may start creating applications in other programming languages, and so we want to make sure that our code is organized based on the language that we're working with. So once I get the Python folder created, we're going to cd into that. And I want to mention, in Linux, when you start typing, if you type cd space py and hit the tab key, Linux will actually finish typing out that directory or that file name for you, as long as there's nothing else in the folder that shares it. So if I had 2 folders with py at the beginning of them, then I would have to maybe type pyt and hit tab to get it to do it. But nonetheless, it'll speed up getting into these directories and opening these files. So we're going to go into the Python folder. At this point, we are testing the switch that we have, that we've plugged into the Raspberry Pi. So we created a folder called switch test so that we know what is in that folder. So I'm going to cd into that folder, and then I created a file here. I'm going to remove this test file. we create a file here called switch.txt or switchtest.py. So we're going to open that file. Now I want to mention we're going through using the terminal to do all of this stuff, and the reason is because we want to learn how to use the computer from the command line instead of using a bunch of GUI applications. And the primary reason behind that is that, especially in Linux, there's a lot of different ways to open files and create directories. And so if you're at a terminal, they're all the same. So we're going to try to do as much of the work that we're doing in the terminal. At first, it's going to be a little bit more confusing because you're having to learn a few commands to make them work. But in the end, you're going to be much faster at moving around and doing things at the terminal than you are trying to open up a file explorer, right click on this, scroll down to this. It's just a lot faster using the terminal. So what this also means is that we have to decide how we're going to edit the file, because there's a lot of different editors out there for editing files. Now, in this course, we're going to be using what's called the VI editor, and in order to use that editor at your command line, what we need to do is we need to install it and make sure that we've got the latest version. So to do that, we're going to type in sudo, and sudo actually is how we get administrative privileges on a Linux computer. So we're going to type sudo, and we're going to type apt install -y, and then we're going to type in vim. So what this is going to do is it's going to go out and install the VI editor. Now I've already got it installed, but on your system you'll see it go and do some other stuff to get that editor installed. So at this point, what we can do is we can type VI space and the name of the file that we want to actually edit, and in this case it's going to be switchtest.py. So we're going to hit the enter key, and that's going to open up our editor. Now there's a few things that we need to learn about this particular editor and how it works. We've got the first thing is that you've got arrow keys on your keyboard that you can actually use to go up and down and left and right and back and forth. However, the way that the VI editor, one of the things that makes it so powerful is that it has two modes. It has a navigation mode and it has an insert mode. And in navigation mode, which is where it's going to be when it first opens up, it means that if I hit the J key on my keyboard, it'll go down. If I hit the K key, it goes up. If I hit the L key, it goes to the right, and the H key goes to the left. And so what that means is that I can very quickly move around in the file without having to move my hand off of the keys. So one of the reasons for learning how to type in the first place is to be fast at what we're doing. And every time you have to pick your hands up off the keyboard to put it on the mouse or move it over to the arrow keys, it all takes time away from being able to program and be able to type. So the VI editor actually allows you to keep everything where you had it, and you're just a lot faster doing things. So in the beginning it's going to be a little weird, and you can still use the arrow keys for a little bit if you want to, but I would highly suggest trying to use the H, J, K, and L keys to move up and down, left and right, because it'll make it a lot faster. So the question is that if I'm going to do that, well, how do I actually type? And so the answer to that is that there's a lot of keys. There's 4 keys that you need to learn, 4 or 5 keys that you need to learn for inserting text or appending text, or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So as an example, if I'm going to insert text at this line, I'm going to hit the letter I, and then I can type in whatever it is that I want to do, and then I'm going to hit the escape key to get back into navigation mode. So now if I want to get rid of this text, I can hit DD, delta delta, and that will delete a whole line. If I want to open a line above where we've got the word button, I'm going to hit the Shift O, and that'll open a line there. If I want to open a line below button, I just hit the lowercase o. And so there's a bunch of keys. There's probably 20 different things that you have to learn to get really good at the VI editor. We're not going to focus on those right now because we want to cover this program, but I just want to kind of give you an idea of what I'm doing. So right now, the first line of this program that we wrote says from GPI 0. Well, if you remember from the earlier video that we did on the program that we wrote, the from thing tells it that we're going to borrow code that other programmers have spent time to go write instead of us trying to figure everything out from scratch. So from GPI 0, GPI 0 is the library, so think about it as your local library that you're going to drive down to and get a book. And the book has already been written for how to work with a Raspberry Pi and the little pins that are over on the side of the Raspberry Pi. So, and we're going to take a look at what those pins are here in just a second. So this tells me to go get the library called the GPI 0, and we're going to import from that library, we're going to go get the book that they wrote called button. So we're importing the object called button, and it's coming from the library GPI 0. And so right here is where we're going to define what that button is. So let's take a quick look at what the pins are on a Raspberry Pi. So as you can see from the earlier video, we were looking at what those pins look like, and we had plugged our pins into pin 2 was our power, pin 3, or this third pin down over here, was our ground, and then we used GPIO 2, which was the second pin over here that we plugged our state line into for our switch. So you're gonna have to, you know, refer to this to figure out what the different GPIO pins are and what the power pins and so forth are, because they're really kind of random in here. I don't know what the logic was when they laid this out, because as an example down here we've got GPIO 5 and 6, and then right under it you got 13 and 19. So this is kind of important that you keep this. You can Google it by just searching Raspberry Pi GPIO and then clicking on images, and you'll get a whole lot of different images on what those pin layouts are. But that's what we're using to actually decide what we're doing. So you'll notice that that pin that we're using is actually pin 3, but in the code where we actually define that button, we're telling it that it's pin 2 because it's GPIO 2. So right here, just like in our other program, we're defining a variable called button. So we're basically creating a variable called button, and we're setting it equal to, and this is a function. And this function comes from the class or the object that we imported. So that's the function name, and we're passing it in the GPIO pin that we want to work with. So when this is done, when it executes this line of code, button is actually going to represent button 2 or GPIO pin 2. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to define another variable called pressed, because we want to keep up with how many times the button has been pressed or the switch has been activated. And so we're going to start that variable equal to 0, because if you remember from our earlier video, we need to track how many times that switch has been activated in the last 60 seconds. So we're going to be counting for 60 seconds, and then we're going to count and see how many times it was pressed. Well, to do that, we got to have a variable to keep up with how many times that button was pressed, and so that's what we're doing with this variable. So we're setting it to 0. And this is a line right here that is a little bit different right now, but you're going to see that when we get ready to write the actual application, this line is going to be while true, like we had in our earlier application. But right now, if I set it to while true, the program would never end. It would just sit here, and I'd be pressing buttons, and it would never close out. So I wanted to be able to make sure that it closed itself and then tracked what it was doing. So what we've done is we've said while the pressed variable is less than 5. So if I press the button twice, it's going to do its thing, but as soon as I press it the 5th time, it's going to exit out of the application, and it's going to show me how many times I pressed the button. Now, what are these guys right here doing? Remember from our earlier conversation, anything that's tabbed over is going to be part of this while loop. You'll notice that this print thing here is not part of the while loop, which means that it won't get executed until this while loop finishes. So this line right here is tracking how many times it's tracking when I press the button. The problem is that as soon as I press the button, that thing activates and it just goes crazy. The computer is so fast that you can press that button as fast as you possibly can, and it will register five presses just instantly. And so what we have to do is I want to track when it was pressed, but I also want to track when it was released. And so this is the trick that we're going to use to only track when the button comes up. So you're going to have to press the button, and then you're going to have to release the button. And that release is going to be what triggers everything. But we're going to take a look at a couple examples of what happens when we leave one of these out in just a second. Then once we release the button, that's when we're going to check the pressed variable, and we're setting pressed equal to pressed plus 1. So right now pressed is 0. So the first time I press the button, it's going to set 0 equal to 0 plus 1. So now pressed is equal to 1. The next time I press it, it's going to be 1 equals 1 plus 1, which is 2. So now pressed is equal to 2. And so this line here, all it's doing is keeping up with how many times I press the button. Now, again, in the future, we're going to be doing this on a timer. Right now, we're just testing things. And this is the way you actually develop an application. We have to go in and test things and figure out how each individual little piece that we're going to need, how it works. And then once we figure out how it works, then we'll start adding all this information together to do the finished product. So right now, we're stepping through how to make the switch work. So once that happens, we're going to print out that the button was pressed and released. And then when we press it 5 times, it's going to break out of there, and it's going to tell us how many times it broke. So let's get out of the program, and we're going to execute this and see what happens. So we're going to type Python, and then we're going to type in switchtest.py, and it's just going to sit here. Nothing is going to happen at all. And so now I am going to take the switch, and I'm going to press it 1 time. And I'm pressing it really, really fast. So I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do it again. And now this time, it should exit out of the program, tell me that I've pressed it 5 times, and that's it. It closes the program and it's done. So it did exactly what we wanted it to do. But let's jump back in this program. And by the way, if I use my up arrow keys while I'm sitting at the command line, it'll go back to previously typed commands. So you can see that instead of having to retype all that stuff, I just hit the up arrow key a couple times and I'm back to my VI. So let's go up here and let's get rid of the pressed line. So we're going to hit the letter I, and we're going to type in a £sign to comment that out. We're going to hit the escape key, and then we're going to hit Shift ZZ to save and exit the file. And now we're going to hit the up arrow key a couple times to get back over here to the Python thing, and we're going to hit enter. But notice that the thing just exited. I never pressed the button. It just exited right out of the program, and it told me that it was pressed 5 times, or it was unpressed 5 times. Well, the reason for that, I'm going to hit the up arrow key a couple times to get back to the VI. The reason for that is because the released state is always true as long as the button is not being pressed. So only looking at the release state means that the whole time that the thing is sitting there not pressed, it's going to think that it was pressed, or it's going to think that it wasn't, and therefore execute the code. So let's do the opposite. Let's comment out the release and only look at the press. So again, I'm going to hit insert, £, escape, and then I'm going to hit Shift ZZ to exit and close. And now we're going to up arrow twice, and we're going to run this. Okay, so now it's sitting here waiting for me to press the button. But you're going to have to trust me on this. I'm going to press this button as fast as I can possibly press it. So I'm going to flick it with my fingernail and just make it go down and right back up. But you'll notice that one click, so I've only clicked it once, but it immediately exited the application and told me that I pressed it 5 times. Well, the reason is because it's not really tracking that I pressed the button or that I released the button. What it's tracking is that it's going to wait until I push the button, and then it's going to go to the very next line and it's going to wait until I release the button. Well, in the case right now, the release isn't looking, which means that it's immediately going to look at the press line, the press equal press plus 1. It's going to print the message. It's going to come back to the while loop. It's going to see that we're still less than 5. It's going to look, yep, we're still pressing the button down, and it's going to do all this code again. And it does it so fast that I can't let go of the button fast enough. So by having both of these lines in the code, I'm telling it, look, wait until I press the button, and then as soon as I press the button, it's going to go here. And then it's going to say, wait until I release the button, and then I want you to go execute your counter, print the line, come back to your while loop, I'm less than 5, and then it waits for me to press the button again. And so by having both of those things in there, we're tracking both states of the button, and we're able to track only the counts only when it's actually pressed instead of actually letting the computer track it. So that is our first stab at figuring out how we're going to do this. So we're using a Raspberry Pi with our switch that we had earlier, and we're using it to determine how many times this thing was pressed. And so now in future videos here, we're going to start tracking how are we going to actually modify this code so that we can make this thing set a timer and track how many times I press it in 60 seconds and start trying to figure out what the speed is of our bicycle as it's running down the road.